Hey guys, so today we get to discuss the first book that we'll be reading today, which is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People by the Venerable Bede. So this first book that we're reading today is actually intended more as a history textbook, kind of as is originally written than necessarily a work of literature. It was written by a priest named Bede who was writing in the 7th, 8th centuries, and he decided to write this as a history of God's work and the growth of the church in England. And so you may be wondering, why does it we're covering this in the literature section of humanities rather than the history section? And this book certainly does have more overlap in the literature and the history sections than most other books do. But what you'll see in this book is that there are a lot of literary qualities. This isn't just presenting the facts on what happened when the gospel was progressing through England. It also is constructed as a form of literature. It has a lot of really good discussion topics. So this is going to be a bit more history focused than some of our other books will be. But I hope that as we're reading through it, you'll see how much of a literary element is in this. Now, a couple things to discuss as you're reading the book. So I kind of first want to begin by just talking about the purpose of the book and what the sort of things are that we should be looking for it. So in the opening page, I guess you can't really see that the way the laying is set up. But anyways, it's just the preface to the book. Bede gives an explanation of what his purpose is in reading the book. So I'd like to read that so that you understand what exactly is the reason that he's writing it. So he says that, "For if history records good things of good men, the thoughtful hearer is encouraged to imitate what is good. Or, if it records evil of wicked men, the devout religious listener or reader is encouraged to avoid all that is sinful and perverse, and to follow what he knows to be good and pleasing to God." So as you can see, his purpose is to show the good things that men do and the wicked things that men do. And then there's an obligation on the reader because he's trusting that you as the reader are going to be thoughtful, devout, and religious. So that when you're reading this, you understand, hey, here are the good things to imitate, and here are the wicked things I shouldn't imitate. So as readers, we're called to pursue those three qualities if we're going to be following this rightly. The other thing that you're going to see doing this is an ecclesiastical history of the English people. It's a history of God's church, and you're going to see time and time again in here God's providence and how the gospel ends up spreading throughout England. One of the things that's very clear about a history book like this is because it's going through many centuries, it's not really following a main character per se. You know, you'll have some characters that pop up and do a lot of significant things, but then they're going to die. And often you're going to see after they die, what happens? Well, the church may kind of go into conflict, or maybe during their time, their church isn't in a great state, and it's still not in a great state after the person dies. However, what this shows then is that the success of the English church isn't going to be built upon any one man or any one person. It's going to be built upon God and his providential work. As you're going through the history and seeing, here are all the things that God is doing through average men as he raises them up to do his work. And then when they die, he moves on to do other things as we kind of see the big story of what's happening outside of one individual person. Another thing you might notice about this book, because it's covering several centuries, is it's kind of repetitive. You'll see that the gospel is going to be prevailing, and that it's going to be receding, and it's going to have to prevail again. You're going to see that the same heresy, one thing that you'll see, especially in the first part, is Pelagianism, that's going to pop up time and time again, and they're going to keep rebutting, going against it time and time again, so that it gets stomped out, but then it rises up again. And so it can get a bit repetitive. But part of the reason for this is that this is kind of the way that history is. Unlike in literature, you don't kind of get these really nice, clean endings. It's going to be a lot of difficulty, and there's going to be a lot of repetition, and this kind of mirrors real life. And also kind of shows the ways that God tends to act through history. So those are kind of the overall things that you're going to look at. One other thing that we'll be discussing about a lot, though, is there's a big difference between the medieval mindset and the mindset that we live in today. And this is really going to be more of a theme of the year as well. It's not just going to be this book. So you guys are going to want to pay attention to this, that the people in the medieval ages lived in a very different time period. You know, one obvious one is there's a lack of technology that we have today. Another thing is that they lived in a Christian nation, something that I don't think we really live in today. Honestly, at this point, our nation, the nation of America, has kind of gotten to the point where there are still definitely some Christian vestiges, but we're moving more and more to a post-Christian society. And so what we get to see in this book is to look back at, here's a time period where the whole West is Christian, something that isn't really the case today. And we want to ask ourselves, why does it look different? And in the places where it looks different, where especially Christianity looks different, we need to ask ourselves whether or not we're really on the right side of it. For example, two things that we may be surprised at. One, you're going to see church and state. You're going to see that there isn't a distinction between church and state. Like there is in America. In America, we've got a pretty clear separation of here's a state, here's a church. You shouldn't really be bringing religion into politics, although certain of us even would do that, given, that we're Christians. But even back then, I think they're going to go farther than many of us would in terms of how they unite the two. And that you have the Pope giving orders to kings, and the kings need to obey them because that's what they do as Christian rulers. And this is something that many of us, especially us as Protestants, may be taking it back some a bit of, should the Pope and church leaders really have this influential of a role on the church and on politics, or should the king even be promoting Christianity as much as he does? These are questions that we're going to need to answer. Another thing that's going to come up is the instance of miracles. There are a lot of miracles in this book, and what we're going to be tempted to come to as moderns is to look at all these miracles and be like, these were garbage. Like, these people were ignorant backwater people, and they didn't know what they were talking about. But I want us, before we judge them on that, to take a step back and think, which is the case? Is it the case that all these miracles are made up? Or is it the case that that more of these miracles may have happened than we originally think? Just because miracles don't really seem to happen as much today doesn't mean they necessarily have to happen back then. Now, perhaps it didn't happen back then, but this is something we're going to need to look at critically. In many ways, the medievals had it better than us. They lived in a Christian times where their whole lives could be saturated with the Word of God in a way that isn't as present in a secular society. This has its blind spots, but it has a lot more advantages, I think, than blind spots. So I think we want to approach these with a certain bit of humility. Not that the medievals were right on everything, they certainly weren't. We want to be aware that in many ways we're at a disadvantage, and so we want to think carefully before critiquing them, and to think about what are all the differences, and to think about whether or not our way of doing things really is the right way, or whether perhaps they were right in certain things. Anyway, so that's some of the things I'd like you to look forward to in going through the ecclesiastical history of Bede. One practical thing I might recommend, especially on the subject of miracles, especially for the first day of class, is to mark all the miracles that you're reading about. So as I'm going through, I'm marking an M kind of on the side of the book next to each of the miracles that records what's happening, because that's something we're going to be discussing the first couple weeks, specifically the miracles, how trustworthy we should take them coming in a history book like this, and how we should interpret them in light of a biblical perspective. So for the first day of class, I would recommend writing them down in your book, just doing a little M by it. If you really don't like writing your book, or if it's a library book or something, that's fine. Maybe just use Post-it notes. Anyways, do keep track of all the miracles that are happening, particularly how often they're happening, so that we can discuss this on the first day of class. Anyways, I'll see you guys then.